1944, Western Europe, near the collapsing German front. By the winter of 1944, the war in Europe had narrowed into a season of exhaustion. The German armies were retreating eastward, step by step under constant pressure. Roads were clogged with units pulling back, civilians fleeing, and columns of prisoners moving in the opposite direction. For American forces advancing through France and into Belgium, capture had become routine. Entire formations surrendered. Support personnel were taken along with combat troops, and among them were women, clerks, radio operators, medical auxiliaries, anti-aircraft helpers, pressed into service during the final years of the Reich and now abruptly cut off from everything familiar. For many of these German women, capture did not arrive with violence. It arrived with confusion, shouted commands in English, hands raised, weapons lowered, then movement, long, draining movement away from the front. They were marched through villages already damaged by war, through fields stiff with frost, toward temporary holding areas assembled in haste. These were not permanent camps. They were improvised spaces, fenced schoolyards, abandoned factories, open fields marked by wire and guarded by young American soldiers who themselves had only recently arrived in Europe. Winter had settled in early that year. The ground was already frozen hard. Night temperatures dropped below freezing, and for the women, many of whom wore thin service uniforms never designed for prolonged outdoor exposure, the cold was not an inconvenience. It was a constant, invasive presence that reshaped every hour of captivity. At one such holding area, the women were brought in just before dusk. They were separated from male prisoners almost immediately, in accordance with U.S. Army regulations and out of practical necessity. Mixed compounds created discipline problems, and American commanders, already overwhelmed by numbers, avoided them where possible. The women were directed into a separate enclosure, a rectangular field surrounded by wire, with no permanent structures inside. There were no barracks, no tents, no stoves, only frozen earth. They were ordered to remain standing. At first, this did not seem unusual. Prisoners expected delays, processing took time. Names, units, numbers. Everything had to be recorded. The women stood in small clusters, stamping their feet lightly, pulling coats tighter, breathing into their hands. The cold bit at exposed skin. Frost crept up from the ground into boots that were already worn thin from weeks of retreat. Minutes passed, then an hour. The ground beneath them was rigid, uneven, locked in place by weeks of cold. Sitting was not permitted. Lying down was unthinkable. Guards paced the perimeter, rifles slung, expressions neutral. Most were very young. Many had never encountered female prisoners before. They followed orders, kept watch, and waited for further instructions. As darkness settled, the temperature dropped further. The women shifted constantly, trying to keep circulation in their feet. Some leaned against one another for balance. Others quietly cried, not from fear, but from the simple physical strain of remaining upright while cold seeped upward through the soles of their boots. Someone finally spoke. Bitte, a woman said softly, stepping half a pace forward. Der Boden, ist gefroren. Please, the ground is frozen. The guard nearest her did not understand the words. He understood the gesture. She pointed down, then mimed sitting, then shook her head, grimacing. Her breath fogged the air between them. Another woman repeated it in broken English, the only words she could manage. Please, ground frozen. The guard frowned. He looked down at the earth. He pressed his boot against it. The soil was as hard as stone. He glanced toward the others, then back at the women. There was no immediate response. He motioned for them to step back into line and walked away. The women expected nothing further. Complaints under the German system had always been pointless. Weakness was punished. Discomfort was irrelevant. Orders were orders. They returned to standing, bracing themselves for the long night ahead. But something about the exchange lingered. Within the American perimeter, the guards spoke among themselves. The field had been chosen quickly. There had been no time to prepare proper accommodations. Supplies were stretched thin. Engineer units were busy repairing bridges and roads for the advancing front. The women were scheduled to be moved on within days, perhaps even hours. This was, officially, a temporary inconvenience. Still, the ground was frozen. An officer arrived shortly after nightfall. He listened to a brief explanation, walked the perimeter, and stepped into the enclosure himself. He knelt, pressed his glove against the earth, and nodded once. He said nothing dramatic. No speeches, no reprimands, just a short set of instructions. The guards dispersed. An hour later, trucks arrived. They carried not tents or stoves, but something simpler: wooden pallets, crates, rolled canvas, bundles of straw scavenged from nearby farms. The materials were unloaded quickly, quietly. The women watched from behind the wire, unsure what they were seeing. The guards carried the pallets into the enclosure and laid them in rough rows. Straw was spread thickly on top, then covered with canvas sheets. Not beds, not shelter, but a barrier between human bodies and frozen ground. One of the guards gestured. "Sit." The women hesitated. Sitting had been forbidden. Rules changed quickly in captivity, but never without consequence. Slowly, one woman lowered herself onto the canvas. She flinched at first, expecting the cold to bite through. It did not. The straw compressed beneath her weight, insulating her from the earth. She exhaled, shoulders dropping in a way that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with relief. Others followed. They sat in silence, wrapped in coats, legs drawn close, breath rising in pale clouds. The cold was still present. Their hands still ached. Their feet were still numb. But the ground no longer pressed its frozen certainty into their bones. No one explained the decision. No one apologized for the delay. The guards simply resumed their positions. For the women, the moment carried more weight than it seemed to deserve. They had expected indifference. They had been prepared for punishment. Instead, they encountered a response, quiet, practical, unremarkable, that contradicted everything they had been told. Over the following days, similar moments accumulated. The women were moved between holding areas as the front advanced. Sometimes they slept in requisitioned barns, sometimes in warehouses with shattered windows. Sometimes again in open fields, though now pallets or straw usually arrived within hours. American units operating under immense logistical strain did not always get things right. Food was basic and often insufficient. Hunger was constant. News from home was non-existent. Many did not know whether their families were alive, but the cold, when it threatened to become dangerous, was addressed. In one camp, guards allowed the women to remove boots during daylight hours to restore circulation, something that would have been unthinkable under German discipline. In another, American medics treated frostbitten toes methodically, without lectures or judgment. Lice inspections were conducted efficiently. Illness was documented, not ignored. The women noticed how rules were enforced. Orders were given clearly. Violations had consequences, but those consequences were predictable. There were no arbitrary punishments, no collective penalties for individual mistakes. Authority existed, but it did not rely solely on fear. This did not make captivity easy. Standing for roll call in freezing winds, eating thin sin soup that never quite filled the stomach, sleeping in unfamiliar places with unfamiliar sounds, waiting without knowing where they would be sent next. These experiences wore down even the strongest among them, yet the absence of unnecessary cruelty mattered. Years later, when many of these women attempted to describe their time as prisoners, they did not focus on grand gestures. They remembered details. The straw beneath the canvas, the way a guard avoided stepping on their blankets while passing through, the officer who checked the ground himself before making a decision. By early 1945, as American forces crossed into Germany, the number of female prisoners increased sharply. Camps became more organized, procedures were standardized. The Geneva Convention was not an abstract ideal to the U.S. Army. It was paperwork, inspections, accountability. Abuse was investigated, not always perfectly, not always publicly, but often enough to establish boundaries. For the women, realization came slowly. They were not being punished for surrendering. They were not expected to suffer to prove defeat. Survival did not require silence. Pain did not have to be endured simply because it existed. That understanding did not erase guilt. Many carried the weight of having served a regime responsible for immense suffering. Others felt confusion, struggling to reconcile humane treatment with years of propaganda. Gratitude, when it appeared, was cautious, often unspoken. But nearly all remembered the frozen ground. They remembered asking. They remembered expecting nothing. And they remembered the moment when the earth was no longer the enemy beneath them. In the vast scale of World War II, no campaign was altered by a pallet of straw. No battle turned because an officer noticed frozen soil. History rarely records such decisions. And yet, for those who sat instead of stood, who rested instead of braced them against the cold, the war shifted slightly in that moment. Sometimes history is shaped not by what happens, but by what does not. No punishment followed the request. No retaliation came. Only a small adjustment and the quiet understanding that even in war, suffering did not always have to be the point. If these stories matter to you and you want them to reach more people, please consider liking the video. We're very close to 1,000 subscribers.